So as a reminder, and I'm going to let Dr. Wardell here introduce our guest speaker. I'm excited about the topic. It's an interesting topic in the continued conversation of the importance and the role of traditional ecological knowledge in the conservation and management of natural resources. I ask those online to mute yourself and to turn your camera off if you don't mind, just because we're going to be recording it. And then afterwards, we'll open it up for questions, both in the classroom, but also those online. You can either unmute yourself when the time comes. Sarah Fuller will be doing that online for us, or you can post a question online. And so with that, Ty, I'm going to turn it over to you and do as I just instructed. I'm going to go on mute and turn my camera off.
Thank you, Royal. For those online that don't know me, my name is Ty Wardell, and thank you for those in class as well. Today I have the privilege to introduce my good friend Mateen Hessami. He's right now coming from Kelowna, British Columbia. He's going to be talking to us about Indigenous-led caribou recovery. And Mateen got his bachelor's degree at the University of Montana in Missoula, and his master's degree up in University of British Columbia, Okanagan. So I've known Mateen for probably 8 years now. We actually met at the Wild Sheep Foundation Sheep Show a long time ago. We were both scholarship recipients, and then throughout the years have just kept running into each other. So it's good to have him join us, and thanks, Mateen, and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Ty. Thanks so much, Texas A&M, for hosting me today. Let's share my screen. Okay, great. Well, yeah, thanks again for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you all today about some work that I'm involved in, as well as some more peripheral case studies that our organization, and when I say our organization, I'm referring to this group, Biodiversity Pathways. It's a wildlife science institute that's based out of the University of Alberta, University of British Columbia, and we support the federal government, provincial governments, as well as Indigenous governments in operationalizing their objectives for monitoring, recovering, and better managing species, specifically culturally significant species, so large mammals and such. And yeah, so thanks again, and we will dive in. So a quick kind of overview of what I'm going to cover. I'm just going to touch briefly on some culturally significant species and why these animals are important for safeguarding biodiversity, safeguarding our lands, and ensuring future generations can play in our ecosystems. The second thing will be a quick overview of caribou, as this is a caribou-centric talk. And I'll be talking about, the mechanisms that are limiting caribou across Canada and the world, really. And then we'll get into the case studies that I'm involved with, either directly or peripherally, and what we can learn from them and how we can chart a path forward in terms of gaining knowledge and understanding from the leadership of Indigenous peoples in recovering caribou. And yeah, nested in that is a path forward, and I'll touch a little bit on a recent research effort that I led called Indigenizing the North American Model. Just a few slides on that that'll kind of tie some key pieces together. And before we start, I want to acknowledge the lands that I'm on today. I'm on the Syilx Traditional Territories, which, as Ty mentioned, is in Kelowna, British Columbia. I've got several maps throughout this presentation, so I'll point out exactly where I am. But a cool thing about the city Kelowna, the name Kelowna, it's the Syilx word for grizzly bear. So grizzly bear is a really important species for the Syilx people, also known as the Okanagan people around here. And furthermore, I'm currently at the University of British Columbia in this little resource shed that we take meetings. So yeah, and to further kick off land acknowledgements, I'm sure most of you are aware of this wonderful site called nativeland.ca. You can search where you are, so College Station, Texas, or wherever you're calling in from, and you can see all of the Indigenous nations, bands, groups that overlap the place that you are. And of course, there's more fine scale detail when you zoom in. But I can't emphasize how great of a site this is for, for understanding the Indigenous peoples that lived in the area that you currently do now. Okay, so culturally significant species. Culturally significant species are defined as an animal that holds significant value to a group of people for utility, for tradition, for food security. And in a Western context and Indigenous context, they can also serve as an umbrella species. So a species that facilitates facilitates the ecosystem of multiple other species that are perhaps lower down or even higher up on the trophic food web. So we have many culturally keystone species, or significant species, I like to say these days. And there's, of course, the grizzly bear. And I just wanted to highlight a few before I dive into caribou that, these species that are important to Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, they're really this symbol and vehicle for large scale conservation. And when we think of the grizzly bear, I immediately think of Montana, where I spent 5 years, and how grizzly bear conservation really ensures that areas have limited road networks and road densities, and there's contiguous habitat for grizzly bears to be connected. And through that, some of the best elk hunting in Montana is areas where there's high grizzly bear densities. So it's just to emphasize that grizzly bears, along with many other culturally significant species, are that umbrella species that can really serve as a mechanism to conserve entire ecosystems. And bison are similar, and there's some really prevailing research and initiatives, such as the International Buffalo Treaty, that's bringing back bison to Indigenous peoples' traditional territories to restore that connection of food security and those linkages of culture. As we know, bison were a really important species for a lot of plains, so northern plains and central plains Indigenous peoples, and they were eradicated with, or close to eradicated with, westward expansion. So recovering this species means a lot to Indigenous peoples, but it also benefits non-Indigenous settler peoples, as if we can protect these large swaths of grassland, there's just going to be cumulative benefits to carbon sequestration, to butterflies, to grazing ungulates. So all this to say I'm a huge champion of promoting these culturally significant species, and kind of under that managing them the best we can, that has benefits to many other species. And salmon are another species that are culturally significant to many Indigenous peoples. They're the lifeblood of many cultures, and the conservation of them, recently at the Wildlife Society conference in Spokane, there was a great presentation by the Spokane tribe, and they talked about their efforts to knock down dams and to restore the flow of salmon, to the interiors, to the Pacific Northwest. And there's just so many benefits that come from this for Indigenous peoples, non-Indigenous peoples. So once again, a culturally significant species at the heart of some of the most prevailing case studies of conservation in the 21st century. And now we land on caribou, a species that is specifically important to a lot of Canadian and Alaskan American and Inuit First Nations peoples for food security, for utility. And I wanted to put this quote up from the Splatsheen, the former chief Wayne Christian, that really centers how caribou were important, and they provided food, clothing, utensils. I heard this really interesting piece of oral knowledge the other day that caribou hides are really thick, and they made for really good clothing for Indigenous peoples, because they wouldn't tear like in thick forest. Unlike deer and elk, I guess deer and elk hides and leather were more prone to tearing, whereas caribou are a lot more tough. So they were a really valued clothing item. And they also made for great snowshoes and blankets for waterproofing. And of course, they are a food source for many indigenous and non-indigenous peoples in northern North America. And so caribou once ranged areas a lot more expansive than they do today. For example, just in 2019, there was caribou in the northeast corner of Washington, in Idaho, in the northwest corner of Montana. Yeah, so really as recently as 2019, they were extirpated, and there's been this continuous northern trend of extirpations for caribou, and I'll get into the why for that, but I wanted to highlight the diverse subspecies that encompass caribou. And today I'm going to mostly focus on woodland caribou, and specifically within woodland caribou, there's the designatable unit known as mountain caribou. And then within mountain caribou, this is where the Western constructs really whittle down these caribou herds, but for good reason, for conservation purposes. And within mountain caribou, there's further unique ecotypes. But I just wanted to point out that here's the current range of caribou. So it may look like they cover a lot of Canada, which they do, but it's important to note the shifting baseline in the sense that they used to be a lot more prevalent. Their distribution used to be a lot more expansive, and even went into the northeast corner of the lower 48. And currently there is no caribou in the lower 48, perhaps a few in the Huron area that dip down into Michigan, but very few. And I wanted to point this map out that my colleague, Dr. Jean Polfus, created. This is a map of Indigenous words for caribou in Western Canada. So to orient everyone, like here's Vancouver, Seattle, and here we can see all of these words for caribou. And this is important not just to point out the unique and beautiful names that Indigenous peoples have for caribou, but also to show the distinction of populations, which seemingly overlaps a little bit with the federal designatable units. And this is to show that, for hundreds, for thousands of years, Indigenous peoples were extremely connected and knowledgeable about caribou. And the third thing this map emphasizes is the distinct cultures that embody where caribou live today and where they once did. And to point out that there are many diverse Indigenous cultures that once depended or still do depend on caribou. And it's just important in every aspect of traditional ecological knowledge and wildlife science, whenever we are talking about or engaging with Indigenous communities, to really know that it's not just Indigenous peoples, it's just, there's a great diversity in the cultures within Indigenous peoples. So it's really important to understand that and not have this blanket assumption that all Indigenous peoples are the same or have the same values or perspectives or future visions towards caribou conservation, grizzly bear, salmon. There's a lot of distinction amongst Indigenous groups. Okay, so diving into the plight of caribou and what is going on with caribou. So the first thing to point out with caribou is that they are not like deer, moose, elk, sheep even, in the sense that I would call all those species I just named more of a generalist herbivore, maybe not sheep, but certainly moose, elk, and deer. A generalist herbivore in the sense that they're highly adaptable to disturbance. They have a wide range of things they can eat, but caribou are a little bit more fussy and fragile in the sense that they didn't evolve to be as plastic or as adaptable as moose, deer, and elk. And that unfortunately is leading to their demise today. And another thing that these generalist herbivores have is that they're more privy to escaping predators. A deer will turn on the jets and run away from a wolf or a mountain lion. A moose will kick and fight back, but caribou not so much. They're a lot more vulnerable to predation in the sense that they didn't evolve to have those defense mechanisms of being as vigilant, running away, kicking their way out of a problem. Their defense strategy was to do something that we call spatial segregation. So caribou, especially mountain caribou, will spatially segregate themselves from predators by being at the tippy tops of mountains and also being in areas that have low productivity. So, for example, in southern BC, they live in areas where the canopy is basically old growth forests, that don't have a lot of early cereal growth. And that's where caribou started to decline. In the early 1900s, when westward expansion grew in Canada and the US, there started to be logging and more disturbance. And when you log caribou habitat, you allow the sunlight to hit the forest floor, and these early cereal plants such as willow and dogwood are able to grow in an area where traditionally they wouldn't, in the sense that the sun was mostly sheltered from a lot of these natural state forests. And yeah, so caribou thrived in these low productivity environments where they were the prominent ungulates. So when logging occurs, that changed the state of the forest to be more open, and that brought in moose and deer, because all of a sudden the forest canopy, closed, really not conducive to moose and deer. But when it's open, they are drawn to that. And so that threw off the predator-prey system in the sense that there's more prey, and now wolf densities increase, mountain lion densities increase. And so in consequence, they start encountering and predating on caribou at higher rates, which, as I mentioned before, caribou are really vulnerable to predation. So that is the short-term or approximate cause of decline. But the ultimate cause of decline is this habitat disturbance. And although this is a picture of like the rainforest and meant for more southern BC, this is a story across the globe really for caribou. When human disturbance comes in and it alters the trophic system in favor of these generalist herbivores and predators that increase their densities. So it's not just the forest of BC, it's the boreal of Alberta and Northwest Territories. And that's just the habitat disturbance front. Then we have climate change. Climate change is also making it easier for deer and moose to live and to move northward. And so those two forces combined is leading to declines in caribou. But it's not all a sad story. So there's a few main recovery levers that we use to recover caribou. And again, the ultimate cause of caribou decline, habitat disturbance. So the number one thing we want to do is stop the bleed of habitat. So basically gain more habitat than we're losing for caribou. And that starts with old growth protection and also restoring linear features. I didn't mention, in this process, linear features allow wolves to move faster and further and increase their encounter rates. And our road densities in Canada are, in BC especially, are just off the charts, sometimes 3 linear kilometers per square kilometer. And to give some background there, like 0.6 linear kilometers per 1 kilometer squared is known as the threshold where mule deer and grizzly bears will persist or decline if road densities are higher. So even in caribou habitat, some of the road densities are like 3 something, which is just nuts. So restoring those linear features is good. And then a really important proximate lever that's controversial is reducing predators, specifically wolves, to alleviate that predation pressure on adult female caribou and promote growth. And it is effective. It's a short-term measure. It's expensive and it's a lot of work, but it is really one of the only short-term measures that we can enact while we wait for habitat to grow up. And then there's maternal penning, and Indigenous peoples have been leaders on this and all of these levers, which I'll jump into more. But maternal penning takes these caribou in the spring, or actually like now basically, we will tranquilize them, pregnant females, put them in a pen. They can give birth in a predator-free environment. And then we let them go in like June when those calves are fast enough to evade bears. And yeah, it does good. This is like an emergency room measure, but it has been enacted for several herds. And then there's more like indirect levers, such as reducing the primary prey. So primary prey being deer and moose. So by reducing those prey species, you're going to also reduce the predator densities. And so you're going to kind of one more step to reducing that pressure. And there's a lot of benefits that can come from primary prey reduction and stabilization, and I'll get into that further. And then there's feeding, which has occurred in a couple of areas, but is just good for fattening up those caribou for heading into winter. Okay, so getting into some of the case studies. So the first caribou herd that we work closely with is known as, it's a mountain caribou, so it's in British Columbia, and they're known as deep snow caribou because they do this really cool migration. It's a double migration. They're one of the only ungulates in the world that will migrate up in elevation in the winter. And they do that because caribou have these big hooves, these like snowshoes, and they, depend on lichen for a food source. And as I mentioned earlier, it's part of the spatial segregation strategy for them to evade predators. So they'll head up to the tippy tops of mountains where they are now. And, there's really no other critters up there except wolverines and maybe the odd mountain goat and whatnot. But this is how caribou have made a living, and a good one, for thousands of years, by not being on the valley bottom. There's more predators, but rather up in the mountains. And so they do this really cool like double migration where they basically, in the fall, for example, they'll follow the snow line down because the snow's too soft, and then they'll follow the they'll follow the snow line down, and then they will go back up in like December when the snow is deep, and then in the springtime they will seek the green up down low, so like in April, and then they'll follow it back up again to calve and to summer and high elevation basin. So again, caribou are this really unique species, and the reason why conserving them is important is because they're this indicator. They're kind of the canary in the coal mine of intact forest ecosystems, old growth forest ecosystems, which are important for carbon sequestration, are important for protecting watersheds. So caribou are really symbolic of this animal, or a symbolic animal for conservation and safeguarding ecosystems. So here's Vancouver, Seattle, and these are the deep snow mountain caribou that I'm talking about. And I'm working a lot with these Indigenous communities that are really pouring a lot of resources and effort into conserving these populations. I had the quote of the Splatcheen, but Okanagan Nation Alliance, Adams Lake Indian Band, Shuswap, Tanaha, Simpk, Little Shuswap Band, they all have overlapping traditional territories, and they've seen these caribou populations dwindle from thousands to dozens. Now they're, I should have put the population, this current status, but I'd say within this entire area, there's probably about 1,000 caribou now, and there used to be thousands more. And there's Indigenous elders that describe areas in the Wells Gray area that there used to be a sea of caribou. And like where I am in Kelowna, there was even caribou down close to the lake here. Teddy Roosevelt actually shot one in the 40s, just up from where I am now. And elders described that the caribou, when they would cross the lake, they were so numerous that their hair would float down, and the hair would basically clump up. So a huge vested interest by these nations to protect caribou, and the main thing that these nations are doing is working with the government to exercise their title and rights, and they're increasing Indigenous sovereignty to protect habitat. Because again, that's the ultimate way to protect caribou, is to stop logging and protect these habitats that caribou need. And while we do that, we still need to pull those other levers, such as wolf control, and of course restoring habitat, and even stabilizing prey populations. And these Indigenous communities are working closely on that. And Splatcheen they're a leading nation. They're leaders in this southern group of protecting caribou. And here's our group, Biodiversity Pathways. We facilitated this meeting that Splatcheen organized, and it was this 3-day workshop where there were semi-structured interviews, there was roundtable discussions, and then there was a day of co-learning, which is what you see today, what you see in front of you here. And we spent the morning listening to elders and community hunters about, their traditional knowledge of caribou and the importance of them, their concerns on the land, with recreation and logging. And a lot of these things, even though, the Western scientists know a lot about, like, it was very insightful to hear some of these, some of these insights, knowledge and histories from the elders especially. And we had a conservation officer, we had federal and provincial caribou specialists there. So, this space and this day of co-learning is really emblematic of how to indigenize wildlife conservation and management, and to have, an equal representation of multiple cultures, and to ensure that there's respectful dialogue from both sides, and that there's also this ethic of continuous learning. And proudly, this is something that we did over this workshop, and again, led by Splatcheen peoples. And this was really snowballed into other efforts, such as a community hunt we put in for a grant for Splatcheen members to have more resources to hunt moose, because again, there's lots and lots of moose here, and traditionally, actually, there weren't a lot of moose. There were almost no moose here back in the day. I forgot to mention that, but because of logging, moose have expanded southward, and the Okanagan, actually, they don't even have a traditional word for moose. That's how new moose are. Like in the 1900s, they started to move in, and of course, that's correlated with the decline of caribou, because increased primary prey populations has led to that imbalance of the predator-prey dynamic, where there's now this really inflated density of wolves, especially where, for hundreds and thousands of years, there weren't that high of density of wolves. And because of logging and more deer, more moose, we've thrown that off. So anyways, efforts like this have been fruitful in leading to meaningful initiatives, such as, acquiring grants to connect Splatcheen peoples to the land and harvest more moose. And again, if you're harvesting a moose, you're in essence in this area saving a caribou indirectly, because you are reducing the primary food source of wolves. And the idea is that wolves will disperse from that area, so not predate on caribou. And that has been proven in a couple of case studies to have helped caribou indirectly. Okay, so that's the Southern Mountain case study. We're going to move a little bit north here to Klinziza. So still within mountain caribou range, but these are not deep snow caribou per se. These are still mountain caribou, but they don't do that double migration. But again, if you can see my cursor, they're just central BC here. And this work has been really high profile and in the news. And my colleagues, Dr. Clayton Lamb and Dr. Scott McNay, Dr. Scott McNay with Wildlife Infometrics, has been a huge part of this. And this has all been, though, the initiative of the West Moberly and Saulteaux First Nation peoples, who have, for thousands of years depended on caribou for a food source. And as recently as just the last couple of decades, they have declined precipitously, the caribou. And again, elders, described caribou in this area as bugs on a landscape. And it was in the mid 1900s, the further north you get, the further the lag is in disturbance. So it was the mid 1900s when Western society really started to make a footprint in this area with logging, with oil and gas. And as I mentioned, not a good story for caribou with that disturbance, and that has led to their decline. And they declined precipitously, through the 80s and 90s. And this is just when Western scientists started recording and surveying caribou populations. But like I said, the indigenous elders described them as bugs on a landscape. So we've predicted that they numbered in the thousands, and they declined to as low as 30 individuals in 2013. And this partnership agreement although signed in 2020, it started to come to fruition around 2013, led by Wes Moberly and Soto. And this trilateral partnership agreement was this big federal commitment to basically support Wes Moberly and Soto in recovering this culturally significant species. And there are frankly caribou heroes, people like Chief Roland Wilson, who said, you know, I want to eat caribou before I die. And many of these communities, including the Splatcheen, you know, there's elders who have not eaten caribou their entire lives because it's been, their numbers are just too low. So yeah, people like Chief Roland Wilson and others within Soto and Wes Moberly are true champions and frankly heroes in recovering caribou. And they started a maternal pen in 2013. They started aggressive predator reductions. And through that, you know, cooperation and weaving of knowledge systems and, you know, initiative and effort between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, this caribou population has made a spectacular comeback and are now well over 100 individuals. This is actually an old map there, or old figure. They're, I believe, at 130 plus individuals. And Chief Roland Wilson and Soto First Nations, they want those caribou to be at a level where it can sustain a community hunt. And shifting northward to another example of Indigenous-led caribou recovery is the Tahltan Nation, the Tahltan central government, which again, Vancouver here, and they're in this northwest corner. And the Tahltan are undoubtedly leaders in caribou recovery, especially in the north. And they're exercising, you know, their rights to be able to harvest animals, be able to manage species, and they've signed some really prominent agreements with the government of British Columbia to ensure that they can have the ability to harvest caribou. And these caribou populations, northern mountain caribou, are doing a little bit better than the southern caribou, in the sense that there's very little disturbance up here. So this is still a very wild area of BC. However, there is still the impetus that they will decline with, you know, new mining projects being announced and roads being punched in. So the writing is on the wall that there needs to be forward-looking conservation, and the Tahltan are leaders of that, and they're leaders also in predator management. The Tahltan, you know, their people evolved to manage predators, as many Indigenous groups did, and there is archaeological and oral history of Tahltan and Cascade Dene people crawling into wolf dens and, you know, suppressing wolf populations because they were competing with their ability to harvest moose and caribou. And Tahltan are doing that today as well. They are managing predators because they believe that that is a limitation to caribou populations, which it certainly is. And they are trying their best to manage the high density of wolves to ensure that they have access to their traditional harvest. And on the northern mountain caribou front, I was privileged enough to travel up there. So again, these populations are healthy enough where the government of British Columbia still issues tags to even non-Indigenous peoples. And although I am Indigenous, I'm not Indigenous to British Columbia. So I still have to abide by the same rules that resident hunters did. And nonetheless, I was privileged enough to harvest a mountain caribou in 2020. And this was really a catalyzer for, you know, my passion and love for protecting the species, and for also understanding the deep importance that caribou have to the culture of the Tahltan, as well as the non-Indigenous peoples who live amongst these areas. And I also include this slide here just to say that, you know, there's no better champion of these lands, these remote areas, than hunters. And I think that that is not a subjective opinion. There's a lot of evidence showing that hunters are champions of landscape conservation. And this, not far from where I harvested that caribou, you know, there's gold mining projects popping up, other mining projects. And this one was really difficult for me to see the the other year, basically, I saw that this was coming on board, and this area is one of the most intact and wild places in North America, arguably. And an Australian company is planning to punch in a road and do gold mining in this beautifully pristine area where caribou are still doing relatively well. There's stone sheep up there, and stone sheep hunters are also champions of this land. So all this to say that yeah, hunters, both indigenous and non-indigenous, hold a key role in protecting these areas, because there's not a lot of other people that get to go into these areas. You have to fly into most of these areas, and so continuing to ensure that these populations are healthy enough to sustain this hunt. And I'll emphasize that, as I'm sure many of you know with wildlife science, like, these hunts are very sustainable, and that the limit is a 5 point or greater, so a mature male, basically. So as we refer to it, a very compensatory hunt, in that it's not having an additive effect on the population. And so ensuring we can keep these hunts open, so long as they satisfy the needs of the indigenous peoples, to ensure that they have first crack at harvesting these animals, is really an important effort and initiative that I think we should promote to protect caribou, and most importantly, the landscapes they depend on. Okay, so a quick shift to boreal caribou. I'm going to touch on a population of boreal caribou here. So more flat, less mountainous. And I was privileged enough to travel to the Chippewa-Dene Prairie Nation, as well as Cold Lake First Nation. And this green here, they're just right about here. So just on the cusp of the southern extent of boreal caribou, which of course used to go further south, but have been punted north thanks to an extreme amount of oil and gas activity. And what I learned from these people is that they are incredibly connected to the land, but once we're a lot more connected. And settler people and colonizers are really good at inserting their values to trump those of indigenous peoples. And I want to quickly, this is a bit of a tangent, but an important one for caribou recovery. And there's been these initiatives to stop the fur trade led by organizations like Greenpeace. And it's important that we all know that these campaigns have had enduring implications to indigenous peoples of the North, who have become dependent, or became dependent, especially with the Hudson Bay fur trade, on trapping animals, doing so sustainably, and trapping these animals for their livelihood. And we see this everywhere. Canada Goose, this high-end jacket company, announced a couple years ago they're no longer putting wolf pelts on their jackets. And many people in the city may clap their hands and say that that's a huge accomplishment for conservation, but really it's the antithesis of that, because we're taking away the market commodity for these indigenous peoples to be on the land. And when I was in Chippewa-Dene Prairie, again right here, I was speaking with the vice chief, and he was saying how in the 80s, most of the men in the community were trappers. They would trap lynx. They could get $800 for a lynx back in the 80s. And thanks to Greenpeace and these other animal advocate groups, there is no longer a market for lynx, or a very squashed one. So it's no longer financially feasible or lucrative for these people, both indigenous and non-indigenous, to go out on the land, to steward these trap lines, to be connected to the land, to foster a love for the land. That has really been pulled from under them because of these misplaced conservation efforts. And I also saw this with Cold Lake First Nation. I was fortunate to go out on the land with them, and here's a youth member trapping beaver and otter, and they're trying to restore that connection that the youth have. So youth aren't, in their basements all winter long playing Fortnite or on TikTok or working for the oil wells. That is becoming the main source of employment, and that is shifting it's taking away that place-based traditions that indigenous peoples have on the land. And that's ultimately going to have a consequence for species like caribou and for the protection of the boreal, because these people don't have or are losing that connection, that incentive to be out on the land. And we know from all over the world that some of the best vehicles, mechanisms of enacting change on the land is a community-based approach, a bottom-up approach where the people most closely connected to the land are the ones driving the monitoring, the stewarding of those areas. So just a bit of a tangent there on the fur trade, but a really important one to point out that, you know, we should really be cognizant about these misplaced conservation efforts, and they're becoming more frequent, even, you know, banning trophy hunting in Africa, where many African communities are dependent on those trophy hunters to provide for their families, similar to Inuit in Northwest Territories, where the polar bear hunt is extremely important and lucrative for, you know, maintaining the dog sled tradition. And yeah, so just a few examples there that before we clap our hands and see a headline that, you know, polar bear hunting is stopping or fur trade is stopping, that we really sit back and understand the facts on those types of campaigns. Okay, so weaving these knowledge systems, I'm cognizant of time here. I'm at about 40 minutes, try to wrap up quickly. So weaving knowledge systems, like how do we really do this? And I wanted to point out some really key citations here for those in this TEK world. I found this report to be really incredible at showing, you know, Indigenous knowledge on one column, Western science on the other, really this two-eyed seeing approach. And give this uh, give this report a look, and you can draw a lot of inspiration where community members describe, you know, the population abundance, distribution, behavior, limiting factors of caribou, and then the Western science, you know, chimes in with what Western scientists know. Also, colleague Dr. Jean Polfus, who created that wonderful map, she did her PhD with the Taku River Tlingit, so northwest BC, close to Tahltan, and she did. She looked at resource selection functions with caribou, so basically charting what habitats they select and avoid, and also their migratory routes. And she had elders sit down at a table and draw maps. And what do you know? The Western science and Indigenous knowledge overlapped really closely with where those caribou were going. This is a picture of our group, Biodiversity Pathways, you know, having these roundtable discussions with Indigenous partners. And this is a really illuminating conversation as we're trying to restore roads. So yeah, these roads we need to restore for caribou, prevent wolves from moving faster and further. But the Splachine peoples depend on these roads to hunt moose, which is also important for reducing or dispersing wolves and also satisfying their needs of food security. So it was really illuminating, you know, the Western scientists here. It was kind of an aha moment, like we really need to consult with the Indigenous peoples to make sure that we're, you know, not closing down these key thoroughfares that they depend on to access drainages to hunt moose. A really key paper for this weaving, two-eyed seeing was recently released by Stern and Humphreys. I recommend folks take a look at it. Interweaving local, expert, and Indigenous knowledge, a really fantastic paper with the 411 of how do we weave knowledge systems. So this really speaks to the Western science, you know, of RSFs and camera trapping. You know, how does that feed into the knowledge that Indigenous peoples have? So give that a look if you haven't already. I'm kind of low on time. Indigenizing North American model. A lot of key themes that I just touched on. This paper that we led with, you know, Indigenous and non-Indigenous authors. So I don't think I mentioned in the introduction, or I'm not sure if Ty did, but I'm a proud member of the Wyandotte Nation in Oklahoma, not too far from College Station, just in the northeast corner of Oklahoma. And Dr. Jesse Pop is a member of the Anishinaabe Nation. And Dr. Adam Ford was my advisor and now director of Biodiversity Pathways, and Dr. Ella Bowles, a Western researcher. So anyways, we we provided an update to the North American model because we found that a lot of Indigenous worldviews overlap and value systems overlap with the same ones that the North American model identifies. There was this, shackling of colonial language that needed to be updated, and that's what we did. So give that paper a look if you can, and here's some points of why we should indigenize wildlife management, leading to good outcomes for people and biodiversity. And I'll just finish on, why we called it indigenizing the North American model. And we did so because with the North American model, with wildlife science, conservation, healthcare, really anything, like the most successful blueprints and case studies of these initiatives to better society always come with efforts that embody continuous learning and are always quick to pivot and adapt. And that's what we wanted to center with the INAM, is to center this active phrasing of learning and listening. So I think that's it. That's the acknowledgements. And yeah, thanks again, Texas A&M, for having me. It's a huge honor to speak to your group. I've always been aware of the prestigious kind of title that Texas A&M has in wildlife science, and a lot of great work has come out of there, as well as a lot of great scientists. So thanks again. There's some references, and I'll take questions.
Mateen, our camera's off, but can you still hear us?
I can, yeah. Maybe I could, I suppose I could stop sharing, but yeah, I hear you just fine.
Okay, well, I'll ask the first question. You talked about how Indigenous peoples of British Columbia or Alberta, maybe it was, are losing some of that connection with the land because they're unable to make a living hunting and fishing, or hunting and trapping. Although you don't make a living as a trapper, do you see being able to do some of this research as a way to stay connected?
Totally, yeah. Yeah, I guess for me personally, like doing this work is fulfilling and connects me to the land. But to that question, so there were actually, up until just a few years ago, especially the Inuit people in the far north, some of them did make a living, thousands of people actually, especially on the seal trade. So the further north you go, kind of the reliance on trapping was greater. I say was because even in the last few years, the regulations have just changed to where it's no longer lucrative. And so, yeah, and to get to that point though, we all become champions of the land from being out there. And if you're not out there and don't have that connection, it doesn't matter if you're Indigenous and you have that in your blood. If you're not exposed to that or don't have an opportunity to be on the land, there's a greater likelihood you're not gonna, be a steward. So I think fur trapping is not just, taking that practice aside, it's, I think, an inhibitor of Indigenous peoples becoming captivated on being a wildlife biologist or becoming a forester. And all that to say that, yeah, fur trapping was a very primary mechanism for northern Indigenous peoples to become captivated with the land.
We'll do a question in the room first, then you can answer the chat, Mateen.
Okay, yeah, I'll look at the chat here.
And yeah, thank you for the great presentation. Really enjoyed listening to you. Just curious if you could talk a little bit more about the indigenous, indigenizing the North American model. And I'm just curious, we're taught a lot that markets for wildlife, cause the demise of a lot of our species, right? We almost killed off the bison for markets and a lot of birds. So how do you go about communicating that, wildlife markets can be helpful and maybe they can be sustainable and stuff like that?
Great question. Yeah, it can certainly be a contrasting thing to say, the fur trapping is good for wildlife, but yet that's a central tenet of the NAM. And yeah, my answer to that is I think the most important thing with markets is it has to be sustainable. And we do know that fur trapping is a very sustainable practice in the sense that yeah, you're taking off, the doomed surplus of the population, a very compensatory practice. And markets for wildlife still exist today. Like you can go pick up sheds from wildlife refuges and sell them to someone who's making a chandelier. So there is still those markets, and it certainly gets technical and fussy, but I think the number one thing that comes down is sustainability, and then the second one is uh, local support and community-driven support for that practice. Those are really the two elements, I think. But it's also important that, like, when we talk about markets for wild game, compared to the markets that were in place in like the late 1800s and early 1900s, where like, you know, the railroads would stop and basically people would get out and shoot bison and antelope. Like it was just an absolute heyday, and you could buy elk and antelope and mule deer in a restaurant in Chicago, passenger pigeon. So it was just, I think, absolutely, bonkers back then and unsustainable. But I think with modern wildlife management and with collaborative co-management, we can maintain those sustainable practices of markets for wild game.
Elizabeth asked, when deciding on harvest numbers for caribou in the Wyandotte Nation, is there a collaboration between Indigenous agencies and state wildlife agencies?
Yeah, so there's been, historically, I think there's been less collaborations, but I'd say in the last 5 or so years, there's more collaboration between the BC government and those Indigenous groups. There's certainly some contention around there, especially around the town centers, where you have people from Vancouver and Kelowna, driving up to harvest these species, and they're harvesting them within the radius of these communities, and that is affecting some of those community abilities to achieve food security. And the BC government is being creative, in collaboration with some of these nations to set buffer zones. So for example, you can't shoot a caribou or moose within 100 miles of that community, to ensure that community members have that first crack at harvesting those species. But like, for example, where I went, it was a fly-in only hunt. So that's, less of a realistic avenue that community members are going to take to satisfy food security. Not to say they're not entitled to that backcountry hunt. They certainly are, more so than resident hunters are. But yeah, it's certainly contentious, but it's, one cannot emphasize enough. It'd be the equivalent, the regulations right now would be the equivalent of like a 4-point or greater on a whitetail. So, a mature-ish animal, 3 or 4 years greater. So it's just a very sustainable hunt in the sense that caribou are polygynous. One bull can breed several. Of course, even high bull harvest can have an effect on like birth rates, but the harvest up there is just not that high. Yeah, so I hope that answers that question.
Again, I was curious if you could speak a little bit more about some of the controversy of the wolf management for the deep snow caribou, and what, human dimensions maybe you went through with that, what challenges there were in the past, how you addressed them, and what the further challenges are.
Yeah, certainly. Great question. So it is a very contentious topic, managing wolves to recover caribou, and especially in the backdrop that the BC government continues to log at unsustainable rates. And it's really, our group, along with the Indigenous nations, are in the thick of this right now, trying to figure out a way to stop the bleed of habitat and protect these lands. But it's just this different system we have in Canada, where there's not the same regulatory mechanisms in the States. There's not the endangered species, well, there is, but we don't have one for caribou yet, because industry has a foothold on managing the lands. So anyways, yeah, the wolf thing is very controversial, because a lot of people believe that it doesn't help caribou, because there's been, some science that came out showing that, wolves have really fast infill rates, which is true. Like, just like shooting coyotes is not necessarily effective at like growing mule deer. We saw that with the Hurley 2011 paper, where they spent a lot of resources trying to manage coyotes and lions, but it didn't actually lead to an uptick in like adult female survival for mule deer. But we have seen that with caribou, and where there is clear, unequivocal evidence of intensive wolf reduction. So it has to be intensive. It's from the air. But if it is intensive enough, we do see those lambdas shift upwards, and we see Clinziza population going up, multiple southern mountain caribou populations increasing because of wolf reduction. And again, it's this band-aid solution. It's not a long-term solution, but it is unfortunately something that we have to do, because even if we stopped logging yesterday, that forest is still going to take 60 years to become to a level where that early cereal growth is not as much and there's not as many moose. But there's certainly controversy. So yeah, there's misinformation, as I was saying, of people thinking that it's not effective at all. And that's, people taking other research and assuming it applies to the efforts done in BC. And then there's also this glass box conservation, where people in Vancouver and large cities, they are quick to judge, the efforts of Indigenous nations controlling predators because they have an affinity to wolves through, the dogs, the pets that we have, the Disneyfication of wildlife. And this just speaks to this altered kind of reality that a lot of our Western society is in, that there's this detachment between predator and prey. And like I said, with the Tahltan example, there's evidence 400 years old that they were crawling into wolf dens and, dispatching the pups. And at that time, that scale and intensity, it's not an aerial reduction, but one can imagine that the footprint that was around 400 years ago, that could have a measurable effect in reducing wolf densities. And even in the southern mountain populations, the Secwepemc nations, they're active stewards of grizzly bear management and wolf management. They're pro carnivore hunting, and again, another like misnomer is that they don't like grizzly bears or don't like wolves, but almost all these nations have a tremendous respect for these species. They just have this cultural understanding through thousands of years that it's their responsibility to manage those species. So yeah, those would kind of be the 3 points I would speak to about the controversy, and say that it's a vulnerable policy, but unfortunately it's a necessary one to protect caribou in the short term. It's not one to like lean on and excuse more industrial activity in caribou area, but it's a tool that is needed in the short term and will be needed, frankly, for many decades.
I think we got time for maybe one more really quick question, or that might be is there any in the chat?
Yeah, okay,
let's do the last question then.
Okay, you mentioned some case studies that have shown that removal of wolf prey has led to wolves leaving areas used by caribou. Do you know why wolves left the area as opposed to shifting the majority of their diet to caribou? Great question. So yeah, prey switching. It comes up a lot. Like, if you harvest the moose aggressively, won't they just switch to caribou? The thing is that the densities at which moose occur compared to caribou are so much higher that they buoy these carnivore populations in a like first and foremost sense. So these wolves are primarily dependent, and their populations are being driven and increased by white-tailed deer expanding in the boreal, moose in the southern, in those deep snow herds. And there's so many more moose. There's like 10 moose per one caribou. So when we reduce the favorite food source of wolves, those wolves are going to disperse. It'd be like removing all the grocery stores in a city. Like, you still get food at a fast food place, but societies and neighborhoods are probably going to need to move areas where there are grocery stores because that's a more sustainable way of living. Similar for wolves and caribou and moose, and that again, the moose densities are so much higher that they're am I still with folks? Something just happened.
We can hear you,
but we just.
Okay. And then, yeah, I know folks have to go, but there's even like a study in Revelstoke where they looked at prey switching and they found a tiny bit of it with cougars and wolves switching to caribou, but it was short-lived. It was just a couple of years. And there was another like confounding reason for that, and that was the 96-97 winter, which depleted white-tailed deer population. So cougars and wolves were kind of forced to switch to caribou, even though there's very few caribou, especially at that time. And they did take a few caribou, but it wasn't detrimental. So it is more important to take away that primary prey food source, as that will lead to increased dispersal rates of wolves as they will seek home ranges with greater densities of prey.
Can you still hear us, Mateen?
Yep, still here, not see, but still here.
Well, I think that means we're done, but I really appreciate you joining us today, and thanks for all those online. So I guess that'll be it for today, and thank you again.
Okay, yeah, no problem. Thanks again, everyone. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions that weren't answered or any ones that pop into your mind. So thanks again, Ty and Texas A&M.